Now, the chronograph is the most famous complication that has become its own style of watch, perhaps only rivaled by the dive watch in terms of general popularity. And given its storied reputation and the variety of legends that make up the genre, it has led to many underappreciated chronographs on the market by comparison. So in this video, we're going to be looking at some of the most underrated chronographs that I feel deserve some more appreciation. So we have this video broken down in a variety of different price points, starting with some more attainable options. Please do keep in mind that when you're talking about chronographs, attainable is a very relative term considering that they are going to be more complex compared to 3-hand variants. I want most of the shine here to go to brands that are a bit more mainstream or at least well-known, maybe have some history. Because if we're talking about new upstart brands, of course, that's going to be a feature of obviously being underrated, which probably is a video for another day entirely. So we have quite a few watches to get into here, but before we jump in, I want to cut to a video because we have a massive, and I mean massive, announcement. Becoming an authorized dealer of Grand Seiko is an absolute dream and is one of these kind of like pinch me moments because I just adore this brand, what it represents, their technical pursuit among their engineering of their movements, their dials, the finishing, it all just speaks to me. I'm a huge fan of the brand. I know many of you are as well. So if you are in the market for a Grand Seiko in the future, please keep us in mind. We'd love to be your authorized dealer. Very excited to announce this, and I just want to thank you all again for your continued support. So this first watch here is one that I'd be quick to mention just because it is often overlooked for those that know, I think know this brand and what they've been doing as of late, but also where this watch comes from. It's a bit of a mouthful. This is the Nivada Grenchen Aviator Sea Diver Chronomaster. Based on that name, you can probably guess what this watch is all about. And it is basically about everything, land, sea, and air, trying to master all of those elements in a chronograph design. So this brand dates back to 1926 and really started to generate their stride in developing this DNA that many people now associate with the brand in the 50s and 60s. One of those watches that were very important for developing that DNA was this watch. So you're looking at a rotating bezel. You're also getting some sporty upside with 100 meters of water resistance, broad arrow style, but 38.5 millimeter case, pretty unique, still getting under 14 millimeters of thickness despite having a Sellita caliber on the inside, 46.4 millimeter lug to lug. This is a watch that I'd encourage you to maybe learn a little bit more about. Can't go through all the details here. I do have a video looking at this watch on the channel, so if you want to take a look at that, I would recommend checking it out. But this is one of these watches that fits in this strange little area where you're able to hit on a lot of these different feature types that typically you don't associate with a chronograph, while also having a history that is pretty cool and unique to them. But that 38.5 millimeter for a chronograph is seldom seen in the market. And did I mention these watches are around $2,000? So right at that entry point door for a mechanical Swiss-made chronograph. So this next watch is one that I have not mentioned that often on the channel, but it deserves to be mentioned here because of the subject matter. This is the Hanhart Pilot 417ES. Now this is a company that has had this kind of mixed history in terms of where they were producing watches. They were started as a Swiss-German company, then they did production in Germany for a while. So there was this back and forth that was happening. But what this watch brand was known for at the late tail end of the 19th century as well as in the early 20th century was being pioneers in the world of stopwatches. And with stopwatches, those being kind of predecessors to a conventional chronograph that we now know, this is something that probably allows them to have a lot of cachet in a list like this. But the model that allowed them to establish this pedigree was a piece from 1954, this 417ES. This is a model that was created for the German Armed Forces and came with a manual wound chronograph movement on the inside. And what they did recently was they unveiled a updated version that pays reverence to the past in a familiar 39 millimeter case size, manual wound caliber on the inside, inside, 100 meters of water resistance, up magnetic resistance to go along with it, all around $2,000. Another fun little side note about this brand and this watch is that Steve McQueen famously liked the watch and wore it. I think he had one in his personal collection. And if there's one person from the 20th century that it feels like whenever they're associated with this individual, the watch starts to go up in value, or at least is seen in a certain light, it's Steve McQueen. You see it with the Monaco, you see it with a watch he never even really wore with the 1655. A couple other points I'll mention, the Super Luminova on this is great. Wearability is very solid and kind of a nice middle ground. And it also has a design DNA that Hanhart can really claim as their own looking back to this period. For our next piece, I know that this is going to potentially get some people like asking a question, all right, why is this considered underrated? But as somebody that deals with a lot of Seiko buyers on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, and a lot of questions about this model family, I think I just want to talk a little bit more about kind of my opinion of this collection, and I'm talking about a Seiko speed timer. Now, the speed timer is very popular. This name dates back to the 6139 being released in 1969, and then you also saw in the early 1970s a variety of different styles coming out, including that Pogue edition, which famously was worn into space. So why am I saying that the speed timer is potentially underrated? Now, I am not talking about the 39mm variants. Those are the first ones to catch up some momentum. But then you had afterwards these 41.5mm case size variants, which in comparison never really seem to take off the same way. Now, I am not knocking people for going the route of the 39 because I think it is an amazing watch. The design is great. But one thing I would like to highlight a little further is that this 41.5mm variant might be the better size for the vast majority of people, or at least a lot of people that are on the cusp of being on that medium to larger end spectrum, and maybe even for those with smaller wrists if they just look at the dimensions. You're looking at 45.5mm on that lug to lug. That watch wears like a true 40. So if you're talking about wearing like a classic Rolex Daytona or something of the sort like that, this is going to be in a great sweet spot for you. And it actually mirrors the lug to lug of the 39mm models. So it does present its own compelling case for why you should maybe look in that direction rather than 39. I just would have thought that this one would have probably taken off quite a bit, but it seems like the 39 is just the one that people like. It might also just be a styling thing more than anything else, but I just wanted to talk about this because I think generally speaking, compared to the other case size variant, these are not maybe getting as much appreciation as perhaps they should. When you're talking chronographs, there's a lot of brands that will always get the typical shine, but one brand that probably should be getting more appreciation for what they did in the early days of chronographs is Longines. I was fortunate enough to visit Longines earlier this year, and one of the things that was just so apparent as you go visit this brand is just how rich this history is for this manufacturer. They are among the best in the entire industry for looking back at first that they developed, and also just a lot of acclaimed and iconic pieces that quite frankly just don't get enough appreciation. If you look at the history of their chronographs, in 1878 they produced their first chronograph pocket watch. That is absurd. We're talking well over a century before the Daytona would get its own manufactured chronograph movement. I just bring that up, not to pick on the Daytona, but just to go to show how hard it is for even a mainstream brand like Rolex to produce their own integrated chronograph movement. Then in 1911, they produced their first traditional watch with a monopusher chronograph. Then they also had the 13ZN or 13ZN. This was one of the most acclaimed chronograph movements of the 20th century. Beautiful to look at, stunning layouts, saw it in a variety of different styles. So then you take this understanding of Longines' history when it comes to chronographs, and then look at the disparity of appreciation of some of their modern chronographs and what they're delivering for the price. To me, I find it is a shame because this brand is simply remarkable. This watch I'm going to mention here is one of all their chronographs compared to like something like the Avigation Big Eye. Doesn't get any attention, but I think it's a beautiful piece. This is the Longines Record Chronograph. 40mm case, COSC certified movement on the inside. You have this stunning layout, reminds me of some of these bicompax chronographs that you'd find from them back in the day. And compared to the military style chronographs like the Avigation Big Eye, this is nowhere near getting the appreciation that it deserves. In a similar fashion, in a brand that absolutely deserves a lot of credit for the initial development of automatic chronographs, we have Hamilton. So Hamilton, with those early chronographs from like the late 1960s, early 1970s, those chronomatics, and what they were producing with the likes of Breitling and Heuer at the time of the first automatic chronographs to be rolled out in the market in 1969, you have a lot of attention that obviously will go towards their Intramatics nowadays, or their Chrono H collection, because that will more closely represent what that era of those early chronographs were going to look like and be designed for. But then you have watches like this. This is the Khaki Aviation Pilot Pioneer Mechanical. This was unveiled in early 2022. And when I first saw this watch, I thought the design was beautiful. It really stems from this Royal Air Force military style design that they were producing in the 1970s, and leans into that with an entry level for, relatively speaking, chronograph for Switzerland that you're going to have just over $2,000. Pretty wearable case, you're right around 40 millimeters, does wear a little bit larger with the lug to lug, has more of a bolstered type of case architecture, 100 meters of water resistance. I actually like the faux markings on this dial more compared to some of their other offerings that they have. I think it looks beautiful, and this is just a watch that, compared to the Chrono H and the Intramatics, doesn't get enough appreciation. So Sinn gets a lot of love from a smaller segment of watch enthusiasts, but generally speaking, I don't think they get as much love as maybe they should, and you're looking at the relative landscape of chronographs available and watches available in their price segment. Here we're gonna be looking at the Sinn 103. You have a lot of different chronographs from Sinn that you could look at. This is one that has always stood out to me for a variety of reasons. So Helmut Sinn, he was the founder of this German brand. Founded it in the early 1960s. He was a flight instructor, and that really gives a sense to the approach that this brand was about, even from those early days. When looking at this watch, you can see some of the framework created by something you'll find with like the Sinn 104, but what I also see with this watch is kind of paying honor and tribute to some of those military type 20 watches of the 1960s. Great symmetry given the function, highly regulated movement on the inside, a variety of options to choose from, the rotating bezel with the chronograph I've always liked as a combination, but something you don't always see. You usually will see a fixed bezel with many chronographs, as you're seeing on this list. And the arrangement of the counters on the dial, the visibility, legibility with the high contrast is just simply a representation of what Sinn is all about. So for this next piece, this is one that I don't think a lot of people even understand exists. And it's one of those watches from a brand that maybe you wouldn't expect this style of watch from, but it is one of the more impressive points of value based on the complication that it has. This is the Breitling Premier Duograph. Now this is a watch that has been in the collection for some time, but what I want to stress here is the complication type. One of the most difficult complications to deal with, if you ask any master watchmaker, is going to be some split-second chronograph. Many would argue that it's incredibly complex, it's a pain to service, it's so difficult to construct in-house. You'll find it commonly for prices well over $50,000, if not more. But in this watch, you're finding it for more just over $10,000, making it the most attainable split second that I know of from a mainstream luxury brand. The Premier family also is one that I think in general is so underrated. It's probably my favorite line from Breitling. This is just more my subjective taste. I know it's never going to be the most popular collection from the brand. The Premier name predates that of the Navitimer and the Super Ocean by a decade. Now, split-second chronographs, sure, it might not be the most useful function nowadays, but it's so cool in practice and how it works. You have two second hands on that center stack. One is going to be hiding and writing kind of right along with the top chronograph hand. And what will happen is if you press in this case, the button at the crown, that extra pusher, that's going to split the chronograph second hand. So if you were timing two different events or individuals or someone in a race, you would stop when the first person finished the race, and then the other second hand will continue moving on, and you can push them back together, bring them together, reset. It's a really cool function, and it's something you seldom see anywhere under $25,000, let alone under $15,000. And this watch is also coming COSC certified, which they don't market at all, which I always appreciate from Breitling. It's just like one of these brands where they don't just state it so loudly and proudly on every single dial that, hey, these are chronometer certified, where we see that a lot in the industry. In this case, it's another thing just to be discovered, just like the complication itself. For our next watch, this is a brand that So many people associate with their dress watches, but there's so much more than that for a variety of reasons, and this is going to be the Polaris chronograph from JLC. So the Polaris name commonly is going to be associated with the Memovox collection, with their alarms that became very popular in the 1960s. This is going to lean into more of a contemporary and mass appealing look for the Polaris collection, and by comparison to something like a Memovox, you're just not going to get as much attention here, but it is a beautiful watch. 35 layers of applied lacquer to this dial. You have a central surface, a circular ring at the center that's going to house a different dial effect compared to the outside. So you have this fine break that just creates this visual interest. Caliber 761 on the inside. This is an integrated chronograph movement, 65 hours of power reserve, 100 meters of water resistance, with that movement operating at 4 Hertz. So I will be quick to say that the Speedmaster collection is at times overwhelming for the variety that you have, but one that I will pinpoint as being underrated is going to be the Speedmaster Chronoscope. This is a model that I find to be very underappreciated because there's really nothing else like it from Omega. Now, is it going to be as mass appealing as a Speedmaster Professional? Absolutely not, but it does have its own unique lane that I think deserves a lot of attention. The watch wears much smaller than its case size. I would say it wears like a large 40 to a 41 millimeter, given that compact lug to lug of 48.6 millimeters for its case size. It's a manual wound movement on the inside, very reasonable thickness to go along with it. 5-bar water resistance, master chronometer, excellent heritage design when you're also getting different scales on a chronograph. Typically, a chronograph is going to be either a pulsation scale, usually that's the most rare. Then you'll have like a tachometer, which is commonly associated with the Speedmaster, and then sometimes you'll also get a telemeter. In this case, you get all 3 on one watch. There's also some other features about this that I really like. At the 3 o'clock register, you're getting a 12-hour display with a hour and a minute hand, which I think is great because it maximizes the real estate without breaking the symmetry of the dial that you'll have with that opposing 9 o'clock register that you'll have on the other side. Quick set hour function as well at that second position with the 9908 movement on the inside, which I find great for travel and is easy isolation and a great pairing with a no-date watch. For our next piece, we jump to Germany again, and this is a Glashütte Original with the 70s chronograph. This is one of my favorite chronographs under $15,000 because of a variety of reasons. One is going to be its case silhouette. You think about integrated steel sports watches, but what about one with a TV case, a watch case type that many brands made, but Geo famously made also during the 1970s. But then you get inside a artisanally finished chronograph in-house produced movement that looks the part and does the part in a variety of ways. Caliber is a 3702 column wheel, as well as a flyback function, 4 Hertz of operation, but that is not going to prevent it from achieving 70 hours of power reserve in the process. Movement finishing is also among best in class with Glashütte ribbing across the rotor and central bridges. You have blued screws, swan neck regulator, and a 21 karat gold mass on that rotor. On the flip side of the watch, or at least on the front side of the watch, I should say, now that we're looking at it face on again, you'll have the panorama date, which I find as really easy to read. And then finally, you're also getting a unique rolling chronograph hours disc and a power reserve indication that acts similar to like a fuel gauge in this instance, kind of more tucked away at that far left side of the dial. So the El Primero is one of these strange instances where a watch movement is more popular than some of the watches that house up the movement itself. Really hard to think of another case where this is happening. But one watch I want to mention that houses an El Primero movement that I think is so severely underappreciated because it brings other things forward beyond its movement that are special. This is the Zenith Chronomaster A384. So the El Primero movement is a movement that I think we know the story of if you are familiar with watches. It was among the first in 1969 as an automatic chronograph movement, but what made it even more unique was its 5 Hertz beat frequency, which still to this day is a frequency seldom seen in the industry. It was also a movement that was housed within the Rolex Daytona for over a decade, but now getting to the A384. You have the A386, which is more of a traditional round watch, but then you have this. It's almost a tonneau style shaped case that I can't even really, frankly, describe properly without someone having to wear it. It is just such an amazing fit on wear on the wrist. 37 millimeter diameter, but that doesn't really tell the full story. You have this relatively thin 12.5 millimeter thickness for an automatic chronograph, which is very good, and then a lug to lug of 47 millimeters. And given that longer lug to lug, which is still very compact, relatively speaking, and then that diameter, it almost bridges this gap and feels like a rectangular case shape in a package that's also more traditionally circular, if that makes any sense. It's unlike anything else I have ever worn, and it's such a cool watch and combination. You have a ladder bracelet, which might be polarizing for some. You can always put it on a strap, but it is a solid bracelet for what you're getting. And then an El Primero movement on the inside, 5 hertz, beautiful to look at, and one of the few examples where you can get an automatic chronograph under $10,000 with thickness under 13 millimeters. For our next watch here, this is one that comes from a brand that most people are not going to associate with watches, but in the last several years, I think they've done a very nice job in broadening their collection and producing some really stellar watches for what they are. This is Hermès with their H08. But this is their new chronograph. Now, Hermès, obviously known for leather goods and other luxury products that many people will think of from this brand. I mean, this is as iconic as a brand name as it gets. I mean, it is prestigious as it comes by. But their watches are no joke either. So this was one of my favorite releases, or kind of like sleeper releases this year at Watches and Wonders. I remember I just stumbled on these watches and I thought they were very well done. This is a mono pusher chronograph, unique, kind of fresh design. And one thing I always mention when I'm looking at this H08 and just Hermès in general, you look at a lot of these more fashion-oriented luxury houses that are producing watches, and so few of them get this right, where you feel it's almost an afterthought. They're just putting together something that's not going to rub anybody the wrong way, rather than actually think about where can we start to inject our own DNA and styling. Where I see it with this watch mostly is the typography. You look at that 8, look at that 4. Have you ever seen a watch with that styling before and look? And that's so Hermès to me, and I think it looks great in this format. Vaucher movement on the inside, they've actually have part ownership of that manufacturer, along with Parmigiani Fleurier, which is a real deal manufacturer in terms of movement tech. Titanium bezel, unique case silhouette, and this to me is just a representation of a brand that if you're trying to be taken more seriously in the watch side of things, how you can do it well with your own taste and flair. And now for our final watch here, we have the Lange 1815 chronograph. So many people might argue with me on this, but I have my own opinion about why I think this watch is underrated. So many people think of the Datograph and what it represented in 1999 when it was unveiled. And I think this watch has become less appreciated by default because of the Datograph probably being right there with the Lange 1 of being the two representations for the brand, and maybe the Zeitwerk also being close by. This is a piece that more leaning into that heritage design. The name of the collection is paying honor to the birth year of the founder, Ferdinand Adolf Lange. And I think it has this classic element of watchmaking, less going on with its dial that might not be as interesting compared to that of the Datograph. But you're coming in with less of a price, less hype around it. It also has a movement on the inside that's going to set a standard for really any high horology manual wound chronograph. This is the L951. It is just a feast for the eyes. Just the finishing on this from top to bottom is stunning. Part of the magic with this movement too is everything is on display. You're also getting a flyback function, column wheel, lateral clutch. See all of that in action here too with that clutch and just how things come into motion when you activate the chronograph. It is so beautiful to look at. And one final thing I will mention is this is a 39.5 millimeter case. We've seen what happened with the Datograph, now really leaning into more of a 41 millimeter case size compared to its original 39 millimeter case. So if you're somebody that wants that original case wearability of a Datograph, but want also something in more of a contemporary form and maybe don't like the design of a Datograph, this is why this watch I think differentiates itself and makes it, in my opinion, very underrated. But all right guys, that's my video here today looking at some underrated chronographs across the industry. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate that. Is there another or other chronographs that you would want to see mentioned in a video like this, or you would recommend to other people? If so, leave some comments down below. I'm not able to mention everything here, so if you have some strong opinions, leave those strong opinions in the comments down below. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of over 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. Also, how we're able to fund all of our productions here is through selling watches on our site. So if you are in the market for a watch, we have it for sale. We'd love to have your business. We know you can buy a watch in a lot of different places nowadays, but it allows us to keep doing what we're doing, and we love what we do. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.